This is the webcast on growth strategies. A common performance goal of most organizations, not-for-profits, B Corps like Tom Shoes, and for-profits alike, is growth. We use many metrics to measure growth, such as the number of employees, geographic reach, product line breadth, profits, and share price. But in the U.S., we admire and approve of firms that grow. In fact, a CEO's pay is often tied to growth such that he or she is paid more when the firm adds locations or employees, even if profits drop significantly in the same time period. Firms pursue this growth in two directions. Vertical integration happens when a firm grows into its supply chain. Backwards vertical integration happens when a firm becomes its own supplier. When eBay acquired PayPal, they were pursuing a backwards vertical integration process. In contrast, forwards vertical integration is any move made by a firm to become its own distributor. Apple used this growth strategy when they opened retail outlets in malls across America to offer their products in environments with sales and repair people trained on their products alone. Horizontal growth happens when firms grow their market share within an industry. For example, American Airlines' merger with U.S. Airways exemplifies horizontal growth. It allowed them to protect themselves from the threat of rivalry, and combining operations extended both firms' market share. Many firms, particularly small ones, choose to pursue vertical or horizontal growth through internal development. That means that they build into those markets, such as Tesla's development of the supercharger network. Without a large network to supply the power to run their product, no one would buy Teslas. Because no firms met their needs, Tesla internally developed through backwards integration by building supercharger stations all over the country. However, this can be incredibly slow and time-consuming. Consequently, growth strategies are often implemented through merger or acquisition transactions. The difference between the two seems simple. Mergers are generally considered to be a friendly meeting of the minds between firms of about the same size. In contrast, acquisitions are generally considered to be purchases of a small firm by a large corporation hoping to control the small firm's resources. Acquisitions are often portrayed as hostile takeovers by small underdog firms by soulless big firms. The reality of merger and acquisition transactions is much murkier than those definitions would imply, though. Perhaps because M&A activity is a long, negotiated process, the language used to describe the transaction will often change over time. What starts as a friendly merger of equals during negotiations will morph into an ugly acquisition after the money changes hands. So you should analyze these transactions with a careful eye towards signals of intent, such as stock buyouts by one company or another, which typically signals an acquisition over a merger, or a new combined name, which typically indicates a merger over an acquisition. The airline industry has been in a period of consolidation through a series of mergers and acquisitions. Southwest purchased AirTran in a fairly unambiguous acquisition because they wanted access to AirTran's routes and the airports that Southwest had previously been locked out of, but AirTran had been allowed into. Likewise, with U.S. Airways and America West. United and Continental was billed as a merger initially, in which Continental shares were purchased by United. After this, and after the name remained United Airlines, many analysts began calling the transaction an acquisition instead. Firms also implement growth strategies through strategic partnerships, which fall into a few categories. The first is a joint venture, in which two firms join forces to create a third, separate firm that's usually named with a combination of its parents' names to capitalize on their reputations. This allows each parent company to protect itself while still accessing the resources, usually the profits, of the child company. A great example of this is MillerCoors. SAB Miller wanted a foothold in the North American market without taking attention away from their international presence or putting themselves at risk of antitrust proceedings. Molson Coors wanted to dominate over AB InBev's Budweiser product line. By creating a child firm together, named MillerCoors, both firms were able to grow without risking their core businesses by exposing them to a firm they compete with in other markets. Another form of strategic partnership is the strategic alliance. Typically, strategic alliances are formed when firms agree to share resources or competencies without forming a separate firm. These arrangements rely on trust, which is often motivated by desperation to access some protected resource necessary for competition. Most co-opetition situations are forms of strategic alliance in which competitors agree to compete to reach some common goal. Again, the airlines are a great example of this. The major carriers in the U.S. are engaged in strategic alliances with international partners because, without these exchange relationships, they wouldn't have privileges to land in other countries. Without the One World or Star Alliance programs, international travel would become impossible. With these alliances, you can board a Delta plane in JFK, going to Charles de Gaulle in Paris, and return on an Air France plane. Although this alliance requires trust that the partner won't try to grow into the other firm's space, these alliances are maintained by the macro environmental control over who can fly in each country. So, the options available to firms looking for growth can be arrayed along a continuum of buy or make. The anchors for this line are acquisitions, which are costly but quick, or internal development, which is cheap, at least initially, but takes a very long time. The middle options are mergers and partnerships by way of joint ventures or alliances, which are variants of their nearby anchors determined by the amount of money and time the focal firm has available. Your textbook provides much more detail on the benefits and drawbacks of each individual implementation strategy, but this is a quick overview. M&A quickly expands the firm, but can be extraordinarily hard to manage. Few are successful. In fact, some studies estimate that up to 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail because the firms were unable to fully integrate. Alliances protect against that risk by sharing instead of combining, but it introduces its own problems because there's usually little more than trust to stop one partner from taking advantage of another. Joint ventures avoid that trust pitfall by protecting the core pieces of their business. Also, the child company is a fully operational, separate firm, which means that it could, conceivably, survive even if its parents went out of business. Unfortunately, though, as any parent of a teenager knows, child firms can be hard to control, and there's little that the parent can do to force the child firm to do what they want it to do. Internal development allows for much more control since the focal firm creates resources that grow it into other areas, but it can take a long time to develop strengths in an area the firm likely had little previous experience in, and developing those strengths can distract from the firm's core mission. This has been a review of growth strategies and how firms implement them. Thanks for your attention.